Rashomon by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. One evening, a servant stood under the Rashomon gate, waiting for the rain to stop. Under the wide gate, there was no one else but this man. Only a single cricket clung to one of the large, red-lacquered pillars, from which the paint was peeling in places. Considering Rashomon stood on Suzaku Avenue, it seemed likely that there would be 2 or 3 others, a woman in a straw hat, or a man in a creased eboshi, also waiting for the rain to pass. But there was no one else besides this man. Why? Because for the past 2 or 3 years, Kyoto had been struck by a series of disasters: earthquakes, whirlwind winds, fires, and famine. As a result, the city had fallen into extreme decline. According to old records, people had smashed up Buddhist statues and ritual implements, gathering the wood covered in red lacquer or gold and silver leaf, and sold it by the roadside as firewood. If that was the state of the city, then naturally, no one cared to repair the Rashomon gate. Foxes and raccoons came to live in its ruins. Thieves used it as a den. Eventually, people even began bringing the corpses of those with no one to claim them and abandoning them there. So when the sun went down, everyone avoided the area in fear, and no one set foot near the gate. Instead, crows gathered in great numbers from who knows where. During the day, you could see them circling and calling around the high ridgepole of the gate. Especially when the sky above the gate turned red with the evening sun, the sight of the birds flying around looked as clear and dense as scattered sesame seeds. The crows, of course, had come to peck at the flesh of the corpses above. Though today, perhaps because it was so late, not a single one was in sight. Only their white droppings, dried and hardened, marked the moss-covered stone steps leading up to the gate. The servant sat on the top step of the 7, placing his faded blue robe beneath him. He absent-mindedly stared at the falling rain, occasionally touching the large pimple on his right cheek with a grimace. Earlier, I wrote that the servant was waiting for the rain to stop, but in truth, even if the rain let up, he had nowhere to go. Normally, of course, he should have returned to his master's house, but he had been dismissed 4 or 5 days earlier. As mentioned, Kyoto was in steep decline at the time. This dismissal was merely a small ripple from that greater wave of misfortune. So rather than saying he was waiting for the rain to stop, it would be more accurate to say, the servant, caught in the rain, had nowhere to go and stood there helpless. Today's bleak weather only deepened the sentimentality of this Heian-era servant. The rain, which had started just after the hour of monkey, showed no sign of stopping. Thus, the servant was desperately trying to find some way, any way, to deal with tomorrow's survival. He tried to devise some solution for an unsolvable problem, while absent-mindedly listening to the sound of rain on Suzaku Avenue. The rain enclosed the Rashomon gate, gathering a loud, rustling noise from afar. The darkening evening sky lowered gradually, and when he looked up, the roof of the gate, sloping forward, seemed to press against the heavy, gray clouds. To do something about the impossible, there was no time to be picky about means. If he hesitated, he'd starve to death under some clay embankment or by the side of the road. He'd end up being brought here, like a dog, and thrown onto the pile of corpses. If he didn't hesitate, the servant's thoughts wandered down the same path over and over again. until they finally reached this inevitable conclusion. But even then, his if remained just an if. Though he acknowledged that he couldn't afford to be choosy, he still lacked the courage to decisively accept what followed. That he had no choice but to become a thief. The servant sneezed loudly and then, with effort, stood up. Kyoto was growing cold with the evening chill, cold enough to make one long for a brazier. The wind blew boldly through the pillars of the gate along with the dusk. Even the cricket that had perched on the lacquered pillar had disappeared. The servant hunched his neck, pulled up the blue robe layered over his yellow undergarment, and looked around the gate. If there was a place out of the rain and wind, somewhere he could sleep undisturbed and unnoticed for the night, he would spend the night there. Just then, his eyes caught a broad, red-lacquered ladder leading up to the upper level of the gate. If he went up, even if someone else was there, it would likely only be the dead. Careful not to make his sword clatter against its scabbard, he placed his straw-sandaled foot onto the bottom step of the ladder. A few moments later, midway up the broad ladder leading to the upper level of the Rashomon gate, a man crouched like a cat, holding his breath, spying on what was above. The light of a flame from above faintly illuminated the man's right cheek, a cheek with a red, pus-filled pimple among short stubble. The servant had assumed from the start that only corpses would be above. But after climbing 2 or 3 steps, it became clear someone had lit a fire and was moving it about. He knew this at once, seeing the dirty yellow light flicker against the cobwebbed ceiling. Whoever lit a fire on such a rainy night in this ruined gate could not be an ordinary person. The servant crept like a gecko, carefully muffling his steps, and finally crawled his way to the top of the ladder. Flattening his body as much as possible, craning his neck forward, he cautiously peeked inside. What he saw inside was exactly as rumor had it. Several corpses were carelessly left lying around. But because the fire's light reached only so far, he couldn't count how many. He could just barely make out that among them were naked corpses and clothed ones, and both women and men seemed to be mixed in. The corpses lay scattered on the floor, their mouths agape, arms sprawled, looking more like crude dolls made of clay than bodies that had once been alive. The faint firelight struck the higher points of their shoulders and chests, casting deeper shadows in the hollows. And they lay there, silent as if eternally dumb. The servant instinctively covered his nose against the stench of decay, but the very next moment, he forgot to hold his nose. A powerful emotion had overwhelmed and almost completely dulled his sense of smell. For at that moment, the servant saw, for the first time, a living person crouched among the corpses. It was a short, skinny old woman with white hair, wearing a dark reddish-brown robe. She held a pinewood torch in her right hand and stared closely at one of the corpses' faces. From the long hair, it appeared to be a woman's corpse. Driven by 6 parts fear and 4 parts curiosity, the servant forgot to breathe. To borrow a phrase from an old chronicle, even the hairs on his head stood on end. Then, the old woman stuck her torch between the floorboards and, grasping the corpse's head with both hands, began plucking its long hairs one by one, just like a monkey grooming its young. The hair seemed to come out easily. As each strand was pulled, the servant's fear slowly gave way. And at the same time, a fierce hatred began to rise in his chest. No, to say he hated this old woman might be misleading. Rather, It was a swelling revulsion toward all forms of evil. If someone had now posed to him the same dilemma he had faced earlier, will you starve or become a thief? He would likely have chosen starvation without hesitation. So deeply did his hatred for wrongdoing burn, like the flame of the pine torch stuck in the floor. The servant, of course, had no idea why the old woman was pulling hair from a corpse. He couldn't rationally decide whether it was good or evil. But to him, this act, pulling hair from the dead on a rainy night in the Rashomon gate, was, by itself, unforgivable. Naturally, he had already forgotten his own earlier thoughts of becoming a thief. Then, with sudden resolve, he dug his heels into the ladder and sprang up. Placing a hand on the hilt of his sacred hilted sword, he strode in large steps toward the old woman. That she was startled goes without saying. The moment she saw the servant, the old woman leapt up, as if struck by a crossbow. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" The servant blocked the old woman's path as she stumbled over a corpse, panicking and trying to flee. He shouted at her angrily. Still, the old woman tried to push past him. The servant forced her back again. For a while, the two of them grappled in silence among the corpses. But the outcome had been clear from the start. At last, the servant grabbed the old woman's arm and violently twisted her to the ground. Her arm was like a chicken's leg, just skin and bone. "What were you doing? Speak. If you don't, I'll use this." The servant shoved her away, then suddenly swept the scabbard from his sword and thrust the pale steel directly in front of her face. But the old woman remained silent. Her hands trembled violently. Her breath came in gasps from her shoulders, and her eyes bulged so wide they seemed ready to burst from her lids. She stared with a stubborn silence, like one born mute. Seeing this, the servant finally became fully aware that this woman's life and death rested entirely in his hands. And that awareness, slowly but surely, extinguished the hatred that had burned so fiercely in him just moments before. What remained was only the calm pride and satisfaction of having completed a task successfully. Looking down at her, he softened his voice slightly and said, "I'm not some official from the police office, just a traveler who happened to pass under this gate a little while ago. So I don't intend to arrest you or anything like that. I just want you to tell me what you were doing up here at this hour." The old woman widened her already glaring eyes and fixed them intently on the servant's face. She stared with eyes as sharp as a bird of prey, her eyelids red and inflamed. Then she moved her lips, which had sunken in so deeply from wrinkles they nearly merged with her nose, as if chewing something. Her thin throat quivered, and her pointed Adam's apple bobbed up and down. At last, a croaking voice, like that of a crow, rasped out in gasps to the servant's ears. "I was pulling out this hair. I was pulling out this hair to make a wig." The servant was disappointed by how ordinary the old woman's answer was. And with that disappointment came a cold contempt that rekindled his earlier hatred. Perhaps sensing this change in him, the old woman, still clutching the long hair she had torn from the corpse's head, muttered in a croaking whisper. Yes, I know pulling hair from a corpse may be a terrible thing. But these dead folk here, they were all the sort who deserve such treatment. That woman I just took the hair from, she used to cut snakes into 4-inch pieces, dry them, and sell them as dried fish to the palace guards. If she hadn't died of plague, she'd probably still be out there selling them. I heard those guards liked the taste so much, they bought it regularly for their meals. Now, I don't think what she did was evil. She had to do it. Otherwise, she would have starved. So I don't think what I'm doing is evil either. I, too, must do this, or I'll die of hunger. And surely, that woman, who knew what it meant to do what you must to survive, would understand what I'm doing now. That, more or less, was what the old woman said. The servant listened coldly, his sword returned to its scabbard, his left hand resting on its hilt. With his right hand, he absently touched the large, red pimple on his cheek as he listened. But as he listened, something like a strange courage welled up within him. It was the very courage he had lacked when he stood beneath the gate earlier, and it moved in the complete opposite direction of the courage that had driven him to climb the gate and capture the old woman. He no longer wavered between starving and stealing. In fact, judging from his present state of mind, the thought of starving was now entirely beyond his consideration. So that's how it is, huh? The servant sneered as he confirmed her story. Then, stepping forward, he suddenly let go of the pimple on his cheek, seized the old woman by the collar, and snapped. Then you won't blame me for robbing you. I, too, must do this or starve to death. The servant swiftly tore the robe from the old woman's body. As she tried to cling to his legs, he kicked her roughly down onto the corpses. The latter was only 5 steps away. Clutching the dark brown robe under his arm, the servant dashed down the steep stairs into the depths of the night. Not long after, the old woman, who had lain as if dead, raised her naked body from among the corpses. Groaning and muttering, she crawled toward the ladder, guided by the last flickering light of the fire. Then, with her short white hair hanging down, she peered beneath the gate. Outside, there was only the deep, black void of night. No one knows where the servant went.